On his third bid for the presidency, Joe Biden accepted the Democratic nomination for president yesterday. The DNC's fourth and final night featured a lineup of speakers who attested to the former vice president's character and career. Let's bring in Lynda Tran and Leslie Sanchez to take a closer look at what unfolded last night. Lynda is a CBS News political contributor and a Democratic strategist, and Leslie, of course, is a CBS News political analyst and Republican strategist. So, Lynda, let's start with you. What kind of impact did Biden's speech last night have on the base? Did we hear enough details about his policies should he be elected president?
Look, I think Joe Biden did exactly what he needed to get done last night. He expressed an incredible, uplifting vision for what kind of country we can be, but his remarks were grounded very much in the challenges that we face today, from the pandemic to the economy to racial injustice and climate change. And so he was able to share not only his personal story in a way that reminded people of his decency and his public service, but he was also able to speak to the concerns that feel very, very real to all of the people watching from back home. Worth noting as well that because of all of the attacks that he experienced heading into this from the Trump campaign, frankly, the bar was not as high as it might otherwise have been for his remarks. And as a result, when he knocked it out of the park, he just, really, really landed a message that I think is going to resonate and really get people excited about casting their ballots.
Leslie, the argument that some Republicans have made against Vice President Biden is that the Democrats were fractured, that they were not united. But the unity seems to not only come from an opposition to President Trump and his policies, but also the coronavirus and issues that I think have drawn Democrats, even if you are more left-leaning than another Democrat, around this central message of defeating Donald Trump. Is there anything wrong with that? I mean, if the president of the United States is seeking to cast Joe Biden as some kind of far-left socialist who's beholden to all these left-wing interest groups, that may be what riles the base up on the Republican side. But if the base on the Democratic side is riled up to have anybody but Donald Trump be president, is there an issue that you see that could sort of backfire for them?
It's a really great question, Vlad. And even looking back to 2016, when you had kind of that lukewarm support by Bernie Sanders for Hillary Clinton, and the disgruntled delegates that were on the floor and kind of that action and acting that out, that wave of discontent that was passing through the arena, that is a very stark contrast from what you see now. That started the coronavirus, you saw a lot of the Democrats kind of get in line. They fell out of the race, and it coalesced around one leader that individuals knew. It was a name and a commodity, so to speak, that people knew what they were getting in terms of had seen it in a previous administration. But let's not forget, the biggest kind of attacks that went against Biden were not necessarily from Republicans. They were internal. They were from Buttigieg. They were from all the lineup, the diversity of the Democratic slate in terms of a generational candidate. Is this somebody that can really understand kind of dynamic needs and a changing world? Those were some of the criticisms. That he was not far left enough. Kamala Harris was talking about that, particularly on abortion rights, supporting the Hyde Amendment. She's much more extreme in terms of supporting late-term abortion, ending the Hyde Act, some of the most extreme positions in terms of abortion, and that is not where Biden stands. So the question is becoming, which Biden are we getting? It's this malleable candidate who is being supported by many different factions of the Democratic Party. But even Bernie Sanders himself has said that come November, should Biden win the next day, we're going to be looking at moving a much more progressive, like, for example, Medicare for all position. And then that adds to the last question. Like, Kamala Harris has been kind of flip-flopped on that position about protecting private insurance. Is this going to be kind of all the failures of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, in terms of raising premiums, raising taxes, not getting to keep your doctor? That's where the rub is. That's where the disconnect is. And that's where I think Republicans are going to go.
So, Lynda, we also heard from Joe Biden's former rivals on the campaign trail, including folks like former New York City mayor and presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg. Democrats have been criticized for giving too little time to Latino speakers and more progressive leaders like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We didn't see Julian Castro. I can sort of get the strategy behind putting John Kasich or former national security members like General Powell, but why Mike Bloomberg and not, for example, Julian Castro?
You know, Michael Bloomberg occupies a very special space among those potential speakers that the Democratic Party could have put forth. And as we heard from his remarks last night, one of the most important and unique aspects about him is his experience as a very successful billionaire businessman. We saw when he was part of the Democratic primary field that there was a lot of concern and consternation from the Trump camp about these graphics that you would see about how much more successful, frankly, Michael Bloomberg has been than Donald Trump himself. And the remarks he made were not just about point of view and whether or not he thought that President Trump was a good person. He specifically said that he hasn't done a good job. And the rebuke, the attacks that he levied on the president were about his failure on the job. When you think about 1 million new applicants for unemployment per week, when you think about his mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic that now has more than 170,000 Americans having lost their lives and more than 5 million having contracted the disease, he attacked Donald Trump from the perspective of his resume, what he has done and not done on the job, and in particular used the term, if somebody did the job like this, you wouldn't want to rehire them and you shouldn't rehire Donald Trump. That is a message that Michael Bloomberg was uniquely positioned to deliver.
So, Leslie, a group of over 70. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, Vlad, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was to add to this discussion, Leslie, I mean, I think maybe your question or your addition to this will be interesting, given that we saw over 70 national security officials who served in Republican administrations throwing their support behind Joe Biden yesterday. What does that signal to you? I mean, I get that some people will say, look, Colin Powell hasn't endorsed a Republican in quite some time. It's not like, all of a sudden Barry Goldwater becoming a Democrat. I get that. But to have 70 Republican national security officials throw their support behind Joe Biden, what does that signal to you?
Well, I think you saw a lot of that and kind of coming in line, the frustration among mostly retired, I would say, either military or national security officials in terms of how the president's been using the military to tap down on a lot of the protest and blurring that line that made many individuals uncomfortable. This had more to do with the president from a domestic perspective, not from an international one. And I think there's a very fair point to be made there. The point I was going to add with respect to Lynda, the big, and this kind of going back to last night, the biggest thing and the kind of the question you have coming out of it is Biden spent a significant amount of time talking about the current situation. It could be national security, the economy, particularly how he wants to end the pandemic. I don't know how you end it just in the United States, but he's saying he can himself end the pandemic at Biden administration. But it was looking, by providing the PPE and some of those aspects, it was almost a speech that should have been delivered in March, when really right now I think the conversation is how do we take where we are right now and move forward? How do we protect businesses from potential lawsuits? That's a big thing that's coming up in the Senate. There could be these coronavirus lawsuits or putting people, maybe malicious companies that put people in, in serious health situations because they're not taking responsibility. All the aftermath of keeping the economy going and where we are today, from all those standpoints, Vlad, is really where this debate's going to come down to in November. And we're going to see if Trump can meet that challenge and articulate that next week.
Yeah, that will be very interesting, and I think we'll talk about that towards the end of this discussion because I'm curious, Leslie, to see what you think about what the Republicans do next week. But Lynda, looking back now over the course of these last 4 days, were Democrats able to pull off this unconventional convention? There were a lot of firsts, in addition to just the overall convention being a virtual one, but there were a lot of interesting things that the Democrats did. For example, we've talked about this, people really did seem to like the way the roll call happened with, groups from all over the country, all 50 states and abroad, casting their ballots for Joe Biden, and some doing it in using indigenous languages or traditional clothing. We saw local food, the calamari guy, for example. And I asked Tom Perez about that. I know he won't be in charge of it, I don't think, in 4 years, but I asked the DNC chair about that. Would that be at least one of the things that they would keep? Because I think a lot of people seem to dig it. Do you see a change in the way conventions, at least the Democrats' conventions, will be moving forward?
Vlad, I really do. I mean, one of the great side effects of having to design it, as you said, an unconventional convention for this virtual pandemic world that we're living in, is that it was designed specifically to connect with viewers back home, not just to the convention delegates and party stalwarts who would have been in the room or in the arena for a traditional convention. And the stylized videos, the speaking to the issues from the voices of those who've experienced it, whether it's an American child whose immigrant mother was deported, or the survivor of gun violence in Parkland, or the farmer who voted for Trump and is now subject to the pain of his trade wars and his policies towards other countries. That convention that we saw this week was able to connect with people on a level that we just haven't seen before. And in particular, Vlad, that roll call was such a visual and lovely reminder of the incredible diversity of this country, of how different and differentiated the different communities are that we have in state after state. And those are all elements that were applauded, well received, and I would fully expect will be incorporated in some way into the future style of convention that we'll see even after, God willing, we have vaccines for the coronavirus.
So, Leslie, I do see it as the Democrats having set a sort of a high bar. The reporting out there has been that President Trump did not like the taped segments that the DNC ran. He wants more live segments, I guess, if you want to call them that, which, as you and I know, and all of us who work in television, that's fraught with risk. I was just watching the Postmaster General testifying there, and Senator Tom Carper of Delaware, didn't realize his mic was on, and he dropped a bunch of F-bombs. And so you're dealing with technology, you're dealing with people that are spread out all over the United States. And, I could see that being a problem. And, I don't even know, look, the ratings for this convention over the past couple of days went up every single day. And of course, they culminated in when President Obama spoke. The question will be, who will the Republicans put on that stage front and center that Americans are going to want to tune in and see? Not the base. We know the base will be there. We know the base will be supportive of President Trump. But how do they get those independents who may have voted for Obama in 08 and 012, but voted for Trump in 2016 and are now back on that fence again, deciding whether or not they want to vote for Biden or Trump? How do you get them to watch? Who's going to be there front and center?
The biggest distinction, Vlad, between the two is that Biden and the Democrats had to create this cinematic kind of orchestration of all the different voices to bolster this nominee, which was really not a nominee that people were excited about earlier in the year, even going to last year. And the difference with Trump is Trump doesn't want anybody in that arena except Trump and people that are going to say great things about his administration. People tune in to see him for a lot of the reasons you just said. It's the wild card moment. You have no idea what you're going to get. And he kind of thrives on that agility and that ability to create, as he calls it, good TV. For people in campaigns, of course, you're sweating bullets at this point. That is the opposite of the structure that you want to see and the presentation you want to give. But that's what's unique and distinct about the president's style and kind of that unvarnished style. So I don't think you're going to see those kind of cinematic moments that you've seen that are almost the beautiful part. Even when you're in the arena, the beautiful parts. I remember the introduction of the Obama family. That was one of the most beautiful films that was made back in 2008. Same kind of thing. You're not going to see that kind of finesse. It's a much more raw, reality TV oriented. We're not at the Tiger King level, Vlad, but we are certainly somewhere where he's going to have his own stamp on this presentation.
Well, Leslie, the one thing I will say, Leslie, is that there are also reports that the president wants to speak like every day. And there some criticism that I saw early on from like the peanut gallery on social media was like, oh, the Democrats are putting all these celebrities and, these people live in ivory towers. Well, the president of the United States, let's not forget, is a celebrity. I mean, that's where, most Americans know him from, is Celebrity Apprentice and The Apprentice. But the question becomes, if you were advising President Trump and you were advising the campaign, would you really advise him to speak every single day? Is that what people want?
Actually, they do. I think what they want is a clear message. The problem with these Democrat and Republican conventions is you hear all these promises, right? It's almost like a school race for student council. We're going to put Kool-Aid in the water fountain, like everybody's going to get something. But you never really understand what that means moving forward. That's why there's such skepticism about political candidates, the promises kept. The president's going to talk about what he has done to make America stronger. He's talking about his unconventional style. And he, as we know, look at the perfect example of the task force meetings on the coronavirus when he started making those presentations himself. Now, some could say that led to a lot of disastrous effects and they ultimately stopped. But there's going to be this balance between the people wanting to hear directly from the president and he having the discipline to take advantage of that and set a course and direction for the next 4 years. That's yet to be seen, but it's not going to be like any convention we've seen before.
All right, it'll be exciting nonetheless. Lynda Tran and Leslie Sanchez, thank you both very, very much. Have a wonderful weekend.
You too.
And as we mentioned, CBSN will have full coverage of the Republican National Convention starting next week. We will take a look ahead to what you can expect each day and in-depth analysis of the day's events every single night.